Hello, everyone, and welcome to Vantage Point Performance's webcast. This is Lisa Wickelman, and I'm our Senior Vice President, and I'll be hosting today's webcast. Today's topic is activity coaching, the itty-bitty nitty-gritty, and this is the final in a three-part series on sales coaching. I'm delighted today to introduce you to our presenter, Michelle Vazana. Michelle is Vantage Point's CEO and one of the founding partners of our firm. She is a prolific researcher, co-author of our best-selling book, Cracking the Sales Management Code, and author of the recently published Crushing Quota. She is an expert in the areas of sales management and sales coaching practices. You are in for a great session today. Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully you're in for a treat. I guess you'll be the judge of that. As usual, I'm going to talk just very briefly about our company, Vantage Point, and then I'm going to get into the heart of today's discussion. So let me give you a little bit of insight that might spur some thought. I'm going to share a couple of statistics with you. The first one, 48%. So what does that stand for? Well, that is the percentage of new hire salespeople that leave an organization within 16 months at an average cost of $115,000 per person. So that's a pretty problematic statistic. The next one is 65%. Now, this is a little different than the findings of one of our research studies, that we found that the average percentage of sellers at QUOTA was on average just about 50%. New research has come out that said that number is becoming even more alarming. And this more recent research has found that 65% of sellers are failing to meet quota. And the last statistic I'll share with you, at least on this slide, is 30%. What is that 30% about? Well, the top performing managers in our study, the top 25%, got 30% more of their salespeople to quota as compared to the rest of the pack, the other 75%. So we've done a significant amount of research that we are getting ready to share sort of the last installment with you. But the research that you can consume on your own time, if you care to as well, is from two books, Cracking the Sales Management Code and Crushing Quota. You can see some of the conferences we speak at and some of the places where we publish. And our perspective is we speak frontline. So we understand your business, we understand your challenges, and we can help close some of the gaps that are most problematic for you. So what can you expect in today's webcast? Well, as Lisa mentioned, this is the third in a three-part series, and this covers the third and final section of Crushing Quota. We're going to do a quick review of what we covered before. We're going to talk about the nature of sales activities, and then we're going to get into a little bit of a deeper discussion of 4 different types of sales coaching and some of the surprising findings. Now, clearly, we can't cover a third of a book in 30 minutes of a 45-minute webcast. So I'm going to encourage you, if you find these topics interesting and you want a lot more detail, you can certainly get that in Crushing Quota. We are going to, for purposes of brevity, we're going to just share some of the more interesting and surprising insights of each of those types of coaching. So if you're on this webcast, sales coaching is important to you. You probably also know that sales managers are a key lever, the most important lever in driving performance of your sales force. As a matter of fact, they've got an outsized impact on the performance of your individual salespeople. And we know that, and yet our most recent study, what we found was 75% of the sales managers in our study failed to get even half of their salespeople to quota. And nobody's happy about that. The big question is, what do you do about that? And think about sort of the tragedy that is 75% of managers getting less than half of their sellers to quota. When you think about that, it's really a double hit, because the vast majority of sales managers were very highly performing salespeople that got promoted. And the idea is, well, they'll just create a whole bunch of superstars. And our research would indicate that that's really not what happens. Something very different happens. What happens is we take very talented salespeople, we put them in a role that they're ill-equipped to be able to execute against, and they fail. And they fail themselves, they fail their organization, and they fail the salespeople that report to them through no malintent. It's just that managing is a remarkably different job than selling. So a quick recap of the studies that went into the information that we're sharing and the information that's in Crushing Quota. The first study was a very narrowly focused study, and this was an examination of 3 different types of coaching that are very prevalent, often trained, and lots of studies around in the literature. So we examined the degree to which managers were conducting capability coaching, activity coaching, and outcome coaching, and the relative impact of each of these types of coaching on quota attainment. We also did a much more granular study of specific sales coaching practices, and the questions that we were trying to answer with this second study were, what are the specific practices that sales managers utilize that lead to a higher percentage of their sellers at or above quota? And I'll just give you an example of the types of questions that we set out to answer. So, high-performing managers, what types of interactions do they have with their salespeople? How frequently? What do they talk about? Do they have more formal or informal coaching discussions? Are certain discussion topics more closely related to success than others? And do these managers spend more or less time doing forecasting and reporting than their lower performing peers? How do these practices differ by sales role? Are high-performing managers spending more time in the field than lower performers? When they coach, at what point in the buying process are they coaching? And when they spend time in the field, what types of calls do they attend? So those are just examples of the types of questions, and of course there were many more, but those are just examples of the important questions that we set out to answer, and we're often surprised by our findings. So here's an example of the 2 of the studies that went into Crushing Quota. And if you recall from our last webcast, when we took a look at revenue attainment, the picture didn't look too bad. So top 25% generated 39% more revenue as compared to the bottom 25%, but the middle 50% hovered around quota, at least revenue quota. So if we didn't dig a little deeper, we would have missed something really important. And what we would have missed is that when we took a look at a different metric, a different success metric, reps achieving quota versus overall revenue achievement of a team, the difference between the bottom performers and that sort of middle of the pack was almost negligible. So what we realized was these middle performers were over-relying on a couple of high-performing salespeople on their team to get them close to their revenue quota. And if you just take a look at the difference in percentage of reps at quota between the bottom 75% and this top 25%, it's really significant. And the question is, what are they doing differently? And how do we do more of that in our company? So another finding, and I'll get to the punchline very quickly, is that sort of the magic bullet to effective sales coaching is all about coaching to activities. There's really no second place. And what's interesting about this study, this particular study, was that we took a look at 2 different ways of measuring performance. One way, which is very typical in a lot of the academic studies, we took a look at a self-report of salesperson performance. So we asked salespeople, how do you think you do relative to your peers on a variety of different metrics? And when we took a look at all of these types of coaching and impact on self-report performance, every single one of them was significantly related to quota attainment. But when we looked at quota attainment, which was an objective measure of salesperson performance, only activity coaching was significantly related to quota attainment. Capability coaching, which is the most often taught type of sales coaching, almost didn't even make the radar screen, 2% of the variance, which didn't come close to statistical significance. Outcome coaching, a little bit more variance, but still not reaching statistical significance. Only activity coaching was directly positively related to quota attainment. So when we think about activity coaching, we know that it has a significant impact on quota attainment, but why? Why is it so critical, and why does it create such an outsized impact? Well, the reason that it's so important is because it's a very strong contributor to salesperson motivation. And we call this clarity of task. And clarity of task means that a salesperson sees the direct relationship between the activities that you're expecting them to execute and the outcomes that you're holding them accountable for achieving. And this direct causal link and clarity of the sales task is extremely motivating for sellers. As a matter of fact, it accounted for 3 times more motivation than incentive compensation, which is a little surprising, right? Because a lot of us have this sense that salespeople are coin operated. Well, not so. Clarity of task accounted for 34% of the variance in salesperson motivation. So if it has such an outsized impact, then how do we go about the task of activity coaching? How do we even know which activities we should be coaching? So from our earlier research study that was published in Cracking the Sales Management Code, we know that there are 4 broad categories of salesperson activities that salespeople execute and sales managers can coach. There's territory management, which is really all about optimizing seller effort in a territory where you can't treat all accounts the same. Account management, which is all about acquiring, retaining, and growing large accounts. Opportunity management, which is all about qualifying, pursuing, and hopefully winning multi-stage deals. And then call management, which is all about conducting individual interactions with customers. So there's 4 broad categories of sales activities that managers can coach. Which ones do they coach? Well, that depends on the nature of the sales roles they manage. So before we get into some of the specifics and some of the specific findings of each of these different types of coaching, I'm going to do a quick poll. And Lisa is going to run this poll. And here's the poll. True or false? Successful sales managers coach each seller more frequently as compared to their lower performing peers. So Lisa, if you could take a moment and go ahead and start the poll, we'd love to see what our listeners feel about this. Interesting. So it's actually false. Successful sales managers do not coach each seller more frequently. So those of you that rated false, correct answer. But that wasn't the only surprising finding. The most successful sales managers don't coach more frequently. They don't coach for more hours. And they don't spend more time in the field than their lower performing peers. Those were 3 very surprising findings. So what do they do differently? So we're going to dive into a quick recap, not of all of the findings, but a few of the more interesting and surprising findings about each of the 4 different types of sales coaching. So the first one we're going to take a look at is territory coaching. So the graphic that you see on the screen here is just, a typical example of a territory management process. It includes some sort of prioritization scheme to be able to determine account potential, a prioritization of customers within a territory according to that scheme, designing call patterns to determine how much attention we should put based on category, executing calls according to our call patterns, and then of course measuring and course correcting, and on a round and round we go. So this is a series of steps involved in a territory management process. Any of these steps can be coached and improved, of course, in the territory management process. So one of the first things that we found regarding territory management was that prioritization is important. And the top performing managers in our study were significantly more likely than the bottom 75% to actually have a prioritization scheme in place that they clearly articulated to their salespeople, and then their salespeople then used that scheme to be able to prioritize and allocate effort differently to their customers. Now, you might be saying, well, 76% of the bottom 75% also had a prioritization scheme in place, and that's true, but 91% of the high performers, so almost all of the high performers did it, about 3/4 of the low performers did it. So clearly this is something that high performers do more readily than their low performing peers. So what are some of the other interesting findings that we learned about sort of this whole idea of operationalizing territory coaching? So when we asked sales managers, do you do territory coaching? And then, what are the topics that are most prevalent in your territory coaching discussions? Those sales managers that chose prioritization of accounts as their most prevalent topic tended to have those conversations with their sellers quarterly. Those who tended to more prevalently discuss call patterns or activity, how that activity is being allocated, tended to have those discussions weekly, which kind of makes sense, right? Because prioritization is a more strategic activity. Executing calls against that pattern is a more consistent activity. Regardless of whether it was a prioritization discussion, or a discussion of call patterns, the most typical time allocation for territory coaching was 1 hour. Another interesting finding was that the sales managers in our study who formally scheduled their territory coaching discussions versus having them as needed were 3 times more likely to discuss targeted messaging. So think about that for a moment. There's a theme that we've seen throughout this research and throughout all of these webcasts that says high-performing managers tend to go deeper and have richer coaching discussions. And think about the importance of targeted messaging when you're trying to better cover a territory and have better penetration in your high-priority accounts. Targeted messaging is critical. So managers who formally schedule these discussions were significantly more likely to get to that level of depth when doing their territory coaching. So let's move on to the next type, which is account coaching. So like territory management, we have a typical account management process with a series of activities that managers can not only monitor, but coach. First being assessing the customer's business need, aligning your need with the customers, developing a plan to create mutual value, and then of course, it's all about executing and course correcting. So now what's interesting when you think about territory management, account management, or even opportunity call management, you have CRMs in place for the most part. And CRMs can measure activities, but they can't really improve activities, right? Improving activities involves coaching. It involves managing, not just measuring. So there's a variety of things that managers can coach as it relates to account management. And you can see some of those here. So one of the interesting things that we found regarding coaching to account management was high-performing managers tended to be a lot more strategic. You'll recall that I told you that when we did our research, we not only found out what types of coaching they were doing, but what topics they were discussing, how frequently they're discussing them, the duration of those conversations. And if you take a look at the graph on the left, you'll see that high-performing managers are more likely to orient their discussions to strategic account planning as opposed to lower performers, but they're almost half as likely to focus on tactical account planning. So you can see this sort of an inverse set of behaviors between high performers and low performers, high performers orienting much more readily to more strategic topics. So what are some of the specifics about account coaching when it comes to operationalizing this into a manager's day-to-day job? The most typical frequency of account coaching turned out to be monthly for all levels of performers. The most common frequencies were between 1 and 2 hours for managers who formally scheduled them. For those who had these discussions more as needed and didn't formally schedule them, those conversations tend to be shorter. And not only did those conversations tend to be shorter, managers who conducted account coaching on an as needed or ad hoc basis were 3 times more likely to focus their coaching on account service issues versus strategic account planning. So you can see, again, a pretty big gap in the quality and the types of topics that are discussed in high-performing versus low-performing managers, and managers that tend to formally schedule versus managers that tend to have these conversations more ad hoc. So the next thing we're going to chat about is opportunity coaching. And quite frankly, this is the type of coaching that we find to be most prevalent in the sales managers that we work with, that we both interview, that we survey, that we work deeply with. This is the most typical and most common type of coaching that's done between sales managers and salespeople. It's specifically important when a salesperson pursues multi-stage deals with multiple decision makers, that the sales cycles tend to be a bit longer. So what you see on your screen here is just an example of a typical buying process. You've probably seen 50 versions of this in 40 different sales books, right? This is not exactly a new idea. But one way to look at this a little differently, and a very useful distinction, is to bifurcate this into what we would call early stage coaching, where a manager's attempting to help a seller better shape the deal, and late stage coaching, which is really more about winning the deal. Not a lot of shaping going on. Now it's all about positioning, negotiating, and trying to close the deal. So if we were to think about sort of shaping the deal to try to impact how the customer thinks about what they're going to buy versus winning the deal, meaning competing effectively and offering desirable terms to win the deal, I'm going to ask you another question. This is another poll that I want you to take. When you think about your organization, what you know about the sales managers in your organization, where do you believe they spend the bulk of their coaching time? Coaching early stage deals or coaching late stage deals? So take just a moment and give us your opinion of where you believe sales managers spend the bulk of their time coaching within your organization.
But it looks like late stage is your winner.
Yep. So,
all right.
So Lisa, we're not surprised by that, right? As a matter of fact, that's probably one of the most common findings when we interview organizations, when we research organizations. What we find is managers by default focus on late stage deals. And there's a very specific reason why they do that. And the reason is because their sales leader is riding a herd on them for the forecast. What are you going to close this month? What are you going to close this quarter, right? So when their leader is focused so strongly on what's closing now and within the next 30 days, by default, that's where manager effort tends to get allocated. But that's not necessarily the effort that leads to better performance. That's the effort that leads to more accurate forecasts, but not better sales performance. And those two are not necessarily synonymous. So in the research, what we found is that high-performing managers were significantly more likely to use scheduled coaching time to focus on early-stage deals. Now, think about this for a moment. It takes a lot more discipline for a sales manager to spend scheduled coaching time to talk about deals that are in the shaping stage, that are not even close to closing. There's not as much urgency to these deals, right? They're not going to close probably in the next 30 days typically. But managers who perform at the highest levels know the importance of pipeline building, not just the importance of deal closing. And these high-performing managers tend to have much higher close rates, much healthier pipelines, and a higher percentage of salespeople at quota. And this was a consistent finding within companies and across companies. You're probably not surprised by this. The challenge is, well, how do you get these sorts of practices being done regularly in your organization? And you're probably aware that's sort of a top-down thing. We have to get leaders to be more interested in the pipeline, particularly the early stages, and not only the late stages. So what are some of the most typical tactical errors we see sellers make as it relates to opportunity management, and how does opportunity coaching help address some of those errors? So if we think about the fact that you have a buying process going on within your customer organization, and you have a sales process going on within your organization, and these stages may or may not align. So a couple of the most common errors we see is when the buyer is already in a buying mode, right, and the seller is now just becoming involved in qualifying that opportunity. They may not be meeting the buyer where they are. They may be trying to go through, this long, drawn-out needs analysis process, and the buyer says, "Look, I just want to know what you have to sell. Stop taking me through your sales process. Pay more attention to my buying process." The other one, and this is actually even more problematic and more typical, is that the salesperson thinks the buyer is much farther along than they are. So the salesperson is given a proposal, and the buyer has not decided they're even going to do anything. So unhealthy pipelines are full of unqualified deals that don't close. And you've heard statistics such as 60% of deals end up in no decision. That's a typical reason that deals end up in no decision, is because it really wasn't a deal. it was aspirational on the part of the salesperson, not real on the part of the customer, ended up in their pipeline and didn't go anywhere. So just some typical errors. And a lot of these ills can be addressed by just having managers shift some portion of their focus to attending to early stage qualification of the deals their sellers are pursuing. So what are some of the findings that we found in our research regarding opportunity coaching? Well, all levels of performing managers across the board tended to schedule opportunity coaching. One of the hypotheses that we had going in was that high-performing managers are much more likely to schedule opportunity coaching discussions. Not true. All managers are likely to schedule opportunity coaching discussions. However, high performers are much more likely to keep the meetings that they have scheduled a higher percentage of the time versus canceling them or rescheduling them. The reason that they tend to keep these meetings more often is because they don't meet as often as their lower performing peers, but they have richer discussions. So if, for example, if a low performing manager might meet twice a month, a high performing manager might meet once a month, but their discussions are for longer durations and they tend to be richer and cover fewer topics. So you can see these high performers meet less frequently for longer durations and they discuss fewer opportunities, but they discuss these opportunities in significantly more depth. So that's a little bit of insight on opportunity coaching. Again, much more detail in Crushing Quota. We're really just scratching the surface here. So the final type of coaching that I like to discuss is call coaching. And this involves helping sellers plan for calls, observing the execution of calls, and ensuring that reps document call outcomes. So this is our last and final poll that we're going to do. What I'd like to do is I'd like to find out from you, in your organization, what do you believe is the most prevalent type of call coaching that managers do? Do they observe calls and give feedback, or do they help sellers plan upcoming calls? So your perception of what happens in your organization.
And let's go ahead and close it out, Michelle. So we are closed out at 54% call observation and feedback and 46% planning upcoming calls.
Okay, so really close. So let's talk a little bit about the research. Conventional wisdom in sales coaching for the entire time I've been in sales, and that's a really long time. I'm not going to give you the exact number. Trust me, it's a really long time. The go-to coaching approach was field time. Go and observe your sellers making calls and give feedback immediately and fill out your field ride form and submit that and put it in the rep's file. Recent findings have indicated that that is not necessarily the most powerful type of coaching, but we do know that that's the most time-consuming type of coaching. And as spans of control increase, as geographic dispersion of teams increases, the viability of spending more and more time in the field is getting more and more challenging. So high-performing managers are finding that they have to use other methods of coaching to get their sellers to quota. And what we find is that high-performing managers are much more likely to spend dedicated coaching time helping sellers plan upcoming calls than their lower-performing peers. Low-performing managers are much more likely to spend time coaching sellers in the field. And that was just shocking to us because we did not expect that. So let's take a look at a couple of other findings. So this one was kind of interesting. High-performing managers are more likely to proactively request a coaching discussion with a seller based on the importance of an upcoming sales call. Lower-performing managers are much more likely to wait till the seller contacts them and requests their help. So you can see here, high performers tend to be more proactive. Another finding that was not surprising now that we know sort of the answers is that bottom-performing managers were much more likely to coach when they're attending a call than high-performing managers. And high-performing managers were likely to coach regardless of they were attending a call. So high performers tended to be much more oriented to helping reps plan for upcoming calls versus just observing calls and giving feedback. And what were some of the other findings? So this was an area that was surprising at first, but when we dug a little deeper, made sense. We kind of expected that all types of coaching would benefit from being formally scheduled. And that was not true with call coaching. As a matter of fact, the higher the performing manager, the less likely they were to formally schedule these types of discussions. And when you think about it, it makes sense because sales calls aren't necessarily scheduled months in advance, right? Sometimes they're scheduled a day in advance, 2 days in advance, a week in advance. So they don't really lend themselves to a formal rhythm or cadence because they're less predictable. So all levels of managers were more likely to conduct call coaching as needed, but even higher percentages of the high-performing managers. These call coaching discussions tend to be between 30 and 60 minutes. And there's another little interesting nuance. High-performing managers were 2 times more likely to use scheduled opportunity coaching time to help sellers plan for upcoming sales calls related to those opportunities. Another piece that was interesting that we didn't necessarily expect is that the higher performing managers had lower planning requirements than low performing managers, meaning high performing managers did not require formal call plans for every single sales call. They had very specific criteria that their reps could use to determine, does this call require more in-depth planning or not? Low-performing managers tend to have more blanket expectations that says, we want you planning for all calls regardless of the type of call. And finally, high-performing managers were more likely to attend early-stage sales calls that were earlier in the buyer's buying process as compared to their lower-performing peers. So those are some of the primary findings regarding territory, account, opportunity, and call coaching. And again, when managers executed these practices, they got significantly more of their salespeople to quota. So we know the specifics of these practices, we know which ones work, and we know why they work. So in Crushing Quota, you get a lot more rich detail around these different types of activity coaching.